Okay, so welcome everyone. This is the fourth Adeva Insight session, and special because this time we're opening it to a wider audience, which is not only our internal community. It started just as a way to share knowledge and experience among our members, but we decided to make it public and share what we've learned with all of you as well. So thanks for joining us. For those of you who don't know about Adeva, we are a remote network of software engineers, designers, everyone who works in technology. We are all about remote work, enabling people to work remotely and grow professionally while doing it. So if you want to join us, I will share a link afterwards where you can apply to register. And now let's get started with what you're here about. So it's my pleasure to introduce Rita Viegas. She is part of our network for a few months now, and she's been working as a senior BI consultant with a lot of companies, including IBM, IQVIA, and a lot of others where data is very important into gathering insights and predicting how to behave, basically. So give it up for her and let's hear what she has to share with us.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. And I would like first to thank everyone for joining today. So as Katerina was explaining, I've been working as a senior BI consultant, and I have some experience in a very big variety of industries. And I think the one thing that was always common in everything I ever worked was this need for data, the need to analyze data, to take value from data and to present it to other people. So from that, I started developing this interest also in not just in sharing data and showing it, but what are the best ways to do it and what are the most efficient ways to do so. So with this in mind, try to put a little presentation with some of the techniques I gathered over time and things I read about and experiment. And so let's get starting. So I think one of the first things that one should take in mind when preparing to do some presentation using mining data visualizations is to understand the purpose. So what kind of visualization, what is the main goal? And we have two, let's say, the main topics of analysis. One is exploratory and the other explanatory. On exploratory analysis, our purpose is to create some kind of dashboard or presentation for our users or for ourselves as data analysts, where we can explore the data, we can look for patterns. We don't have an end in mind yet, so it's like the beginning stage when we want to look at all the data and understand what we have and explore it. So if we are creating something as a dashboard, we just want to make sure we have the biggest amount of filters possible so that users can explore, try different combinations. The other one is the explanatory analysis, which is actually what I'll be focusing more during this presentation. And it's the kind of data visualization we create when we have an end goal in mind. So there's something specific that we want to convey to our audience. And so most of this presentation will be about what kind of tools, techniques, what things should we take in mind when we have such a point, such a goal to present to the audience. So I'd say the first thing the first thing would be to understand if we are in the presence of explanatory or exploratory analysis. But and for both of them this is possible, but let's take the case of explanatory. So first thing is to understand the context. Before jumping and starting to do something, take a step back to understand and answer the who, the what, and the how. The who relates to who is our audience. Who are we conveying our message to? Are they high-level people? Should we present like summary numbers? Or they're more analysis team that want to see all the data and search for things themselves? Is this audience that we have, could it be biased or not? So we should keep in mind to who are we talking to? Do they have all the background information needed? Should we add more notes, less? So it's something to keep in mind. Next is to understand what. So what is the purpose? And if we don't have a what, maybe there's no point in creating a data visualization at all. So it should be have a clear, and if we are making explanatory visualization, we should have a clear goal of what are we trying to convey, what is the point we want our audience to understand, or what are the points that we want them to look at so that they can take action afterwards. Knowing the who and the what comes the part of the how. That is when we actually create a visualization. So it's the time where we should look at the data we have, what is the best set of data that we can use to pass our message, what is the best visualization technique, the best visual that we should use to pass this message clearly. And this is what we'll be working on talking about next. That is choosing an effective visual. So once we know what exactly we want to pass, what is the message, or to what numbers, to what conclusions we want our audience to look at, comes the time of thinking what is the best visual to pass this information. One that is maybe rarely used, but that is quite powerful, is the use of simple text. So if we have just a few numbers to communicate, rather than putting in a bars chart or in some kind of complicated version, the best is just to make a very simple use of text. So we should think about what number do we want to highlight. We should put it as big as possible and just keep small words and text next to it. So it passes a very strong message, very direct, of what numbers we want to highlight. Then we have tables. Tables can be sometimes a dangerous thing to use. For example, if we put a table in a presentation, we can take the risk of having our audience looking every number one by one. So on one side, if, for example, we want to make a clear point, maybe we should use a table and highlight which cells we want our audience to look at. At the same time, the table has a good thing that it allows you to condense a lot of information. So if you have, for example, an audience of a mixed audience where people, like if we have high-level people, they might be more interested in the aggregation values. If we have a more technical team, they might want to look at row by row. So it gives you the opportunity to pass information at a wider mixed audience. The one thing to take attention though when creating a table is not to overload the design. So we have here some examples, the slight differences in having heavy borders, white borders, removing some of the margins. So basically we want to draw attention because the table is already quite heavy by itself and not so much information. So we don't want to distract our audience and just basically keep to the most the attention on the information. So just making the design as simple as possible, as clear as possible. An alternative to tables that I think are quite powerful are heatmaps. So if we have values that we want our audience to compare or to quickly understand the differences in values, or good and bad, or high and low, using a heatmap, we can choose a color scheme. We can use just one color with different saturation, or can use something more green and red to draw attention to good and bad. And this one, you can see on this example just how easier it is to look at a heat map and quickly understand where are the high values of 100%, where are the low values, compared to the table where you actually have to look one by one. And if you want to make something as a row analysis, or like look at group 1, group 2, and understand which group has the higher values, it's much easier if you use the color scheme. Another option is the Scatterplot. It basically allows you to visually show the relationship between two variables. So with this, you can very easily find correlation between variables if they're proportional, not proportional, inversely proportional. It has this setback that you cannot really do it with much more than two variables, although you can use color as a third variable to basically to segment the data and to see which part is more influenced by which variable. At an extreme case, you could also use data markers, so different symbols besides the colors, but at the end it ends up just being too much overload on the graphics, I think. So if you have more than 3 variables, you should look at other options, best ways to show your data visually. Then we have the line graphs, which are quite common, but they are also one of the best ways to show evolution over time. So they allow you very easily to take a look and understand if your measure is going up, going down. They're also quite powerful if you put for example, two categories together. Just one thing that people should pay attention is to avoid creating graphs that they call the spaghetti-like graphs. So basically, when you have too many categories and you just want to show everything at once, it can become very confusing. Sometimes it might be best to arrange the graph side by side, so one category by graph, rather than putting it all together. Also, using a graph like this with too many colors also becomes super hard to distinguish. So sometimes, for example, on this example on the bottom right, it's better to use just one graph with one color, with the outstanding color, and compare it to the rest, than to have one graph where each category has a different color, which will basically will lose our audience trying to figure out one by one. So again, we should have a clear point what we want to show. We want to show that this category increased in sales, or that one dropped. And also, if we have a specific moment in time that we want, for example, our audience to look at, that since last year the sales number dropped or increased, can be super helpful to add this as a note on the graphs, to create like a vertical line just pointing to that moment in time. So basically, we shouldn't let our audience to figure by themselves what we specifically want them to look at. So there's a lot of ways to play with these graphs, or adding little comments, little notes just above a specific point in time. And so we can work with that. On one side, simplify, not have too much things, but on the other, make sure we point to the place where we want our audience to look at. Then we have slope graphs. That is a less used case, but also quite interesting. It basically allows us to compare multiple categories across 2 time periods, or 2 points of comparison. So with this, we can see the relative increase or decrease on each category, and can show it as also the same issue. If we have too many categories, we can end up with a very complicated graph. So we should be wise about when to use it, and always highlight what is our purpose. If it is that one category was always the top one, if one category dropped a lot, we can also divide it in like the categories that increased and cover them in one color, and the categories that decreased and cover them in another. So just it's important. It's a very interesting graph to show this, to quickly show the variation of a lot of categories, but we should keep in mind just not to add too much things, too many colors, and in a graph that is very hard to read. And we have the bar chart. That is one of the most common types of charts, and sometimes people might, I think there's a common tendency to use things more complicated because we want our graphs and visualizations to look fancy, more elaborated. But sometimes, and almost always, the simpler the better. So the bar charts, because they're so common, it's quite easy for people to understand what is the point we are trying to convey. So they don't have to actually spend this mental processing, looking at the data, trying to understand what is this kind of graph, what is the point. So the bar chart is always a very good go-to option. One thing quite important though is that our eyes end up comparing the end of the bars, and to drive this comparison, if it increased, decreased. So it makes quite a big difference. You can see in the example below. On the first example, we have a baseline of 27%. And so it seems between 2017 and 2019 that there was a huge increase. But actually, but it's a relative huge increase, because if we put the baseline at 0, we can see that the increase was not that big. So it's quite important to always use a 0 baseline. And this is something that you can see, and that really bias the audience. If we change the baselines, we can make things seem much more dramatic than they really are, or can make the increase look much bigger than it actually is. So just as a rule of thumb, always use 0 as a baseline. Another option that you can look at is considering if we want to have a legend or add the axis. So in this case, I put both just to show a bit the options. But basically, if we have too many bars, it might become quite difficult to read the bar most to the right and compare it to the axis to drive the number. So sometimes it's just better to have the number on top. Other times we might, maybe we'll just have two bars, there's really no point. So just keep that in mind that there are different options. I personally prefer always to add the legend close to the column. I think makes it much easier to read than to look to the left and or sometimes even with your finger to go and check the actual value, what it was. Another interesting option is the stacked vertical bars. So they work a little bit like the bar charts. So it's quite easy. If we compare the tops, we can very quickly understand the variation, if it increased, if it decreased. The thing is that it allows you to add basically one more variable that we can see based on color. So you can compare the increases in the totals, but also understand the contribution of each subcomponent of the total. In this point, you should pay some attention to which is the category, for example, that you want to highlight, which one is the most important, because the one closest to the zero axis is the one easiest to compare, again, because it has that zero baseline. So one should pay some attention to the order of categories. Another interesting thing is that you can use this to show the absolute values in totals, or to do it by percentage and just have all the bars equally summing to 100%. Then we have the horizontal bars that in a way are quite similar to the vertical bars, but they are a much better option if we have categorical data that we want to compare. On one side, because we can read the categories and have the bars right next to it. One interesting thing also to take in mind is that the data is normally processed in Z shapes. So normally every person, when they look at the visualization at the presentation like this, they start on the top, up top left corner of the visualization. So when we are creating these horizontal bars, we should pay some attention to the point that we are making, because the most top left category will be the first one to be seen by our audience. So if the point is about, for example, which category had the most revenue, maybe we order it so that the bigger category appears on top. If we want to highlight which one had the least revenue, so we do it upside down. If our point is not about if it's the one with the highest or the lowest, but a specific category, then we should have that one on top. So just think that the way you display the data, it actually affects the way people read it and to what they pay more attention to. And similarly, we also have the stacked horizontal bars that, well, they work very, very similar to the vertical ones, but again, they're more useful when we have categorical data that we want to compare. And again, it works on the same way. So we should, in this example, attention is drawn first to the furniture category, but we can also play with it to try to understand and to order it in the way that we think our audience should first pay attention to. The one kind of visual that is really not very advisable to use are the pie charts. If you see, for example, on this graph on the left, it's quite hard. If you wouldn't have the example on the right, it would be quite hard to understand the order of categories or how bigger one is over the other. Sometimes the labels can help, but visually, actually, the pie chart doesn't really help. I think the one time pie chart can be helpful is if we only have one category and we want to show something as 20% over the total or 50% over the total. But when we are comparing categories, it's much, much better to use the horizontal bar charts. And at the end, it's all about, I think the purpose of using visualizations is to look for the simplest, easier visualization for our audience. Basically, we don't want to have our audience looking, comparing, using a lot of mental processing to understand what kind of thing are we trying to pass, but just to make it as clear and simple as possible. Also, a tip that's quite useful if before preparing a visualization or a presentation is just to have a goal in mind, prepare it, and then ask a third person, someone who knows nothing about our idea, what we want to pass, and ask them to look at our graphs or visualizations, and basically first see how they observe the data. We can ask them, okay, just tell me what are you seeing, what are you drawn to, what conclusion do you take, and based on that we can iterate. I know it's quite, if we work a long time in our own visualizations, our own mind starts being a bit biased, and because we have so much background information, we think everybody will look at it in the same way. So it's super helpful to get an exterior person and basically just go through this process, see what they notice first or not, and iterate, and just try to come to the easiest thing that can be the quickest to understand. So there's not a point of making it fancier or not, but just really making it simple and straight to the point that we want to pass. So with this in mind, the next section, I want to talk a little bit about simplification, so just making things as simple as possible. There's this phrase quite interesting, you achieved perfection, not when you have nothing more to add, but when you have nothing to take away. And I think very often, especially if we even like creating a presentation, we have a lot of empty space and we just think, oh, it's too empty, I should add this more thing. Or very often also when working with clients and I'm preparing some dashboard and they say, oh, there's too much space here, let's create one more visualization to put in this corner or in this top part. And actually, the more things we add, the more difficult it is for users to process, because they get this overload of data. So we should, as a rule of thumb, everything that doesn't add value should be removed, or the opposite, we should only add things that we have a point in adding, and not add just because we are uncomfortable with the white space. And so I want to quickly go through an example of a visualization and some quick tips on how this specific graph could look a little bit better with the increase of sales over time. So the first thing is to remove borders. I think in some softwares, mainly Excel, the default is always very with borders with everything, but with some effort we can simplify it, and it immediately becomes much clearer. The next one is to remove grid lines. Again, depends. This one could be a matter of taste, of situation. Depends a little bit what is our purpose or our point. We actually want users to go one by one, compare each point. And even then, probably just having the legend above it or the most important points is much easier, much more direct than having the grid lines and assuming users are actually going to go up to the axis to check the value point by point. The next one is to remove the data markers. So probably if we have evolution over time, we don't actually want users to go and check point by point again what was the exact value. If our interest is in the maximum value, we can leave the data marker at that point. If it was the minimum, we can leave it there. If it was a specific point in time, we should just have a line pointing that out. But just when we have the data markers for every possible point and legend for every possible point, it just creates, there's too much information, and I think our users can get confused. So it's almost like exploratory. We want users to go through everything and look at every possible thing. So we should pay attention what's the point we are trying to make. And if the point is just that, for example, sales increased on the two categories over time, then there's no need for markers. Actually, we just want to show a trend over time. The next one is our axis. For example, in this one, you can see in the sales, we have the 1,000 zeros that actually don't really add value once you know we are talking about 10,000, 20,000. In the month axis also, we have the 2019 repeating, we have the numbers, they don't really fit always. So there's some ways to make it simpler, more direct. So for example, on sales, we can have the units and parentheses, we can shorten and just leave the K instead of all the zeros. So normally if you put the months, the short form, then there's no need to write month below. You can add then the year, 2019 or not, depending on your case. If everybody will know we are talking about a specific year, then there's no need, but it's better just to have the year showing big than actually like one by one, say it's December from 2019 or January. Next thing is about labels. So it's much easier, much faster to read the data if we have our labels next to the end of the lines than if we have, like we did here at the top. Because like this, you check, okay, furniture is the blue, then you have to look down. So basically your head is always, and the more lines you have and the more complex, the more you make your audience actually look side by side to compare the data. So we just basically make it much easier, simpler, if we have the labels right next to the end of the graphs. And the next thing is to use the color. So we know blue is for furniture, technology is yellow. So just the fact of having the same color in the legends, it just makes it much more automatic. So again, we don't have to make this translation. Okay, that was furniture, the white corresponds to blue. So basically we just take all that processing from our audience. So we just make it much simpler. We can compare now basically the end result with the beginning, and once you start taking attention to this, you start walking around and seeing so many visualizations that basically they do too much. They have too many things and there's no actual purpose. So simple things sometimes as removing the axes or the markers can really help make it simpler, lighter, and much more to the point. Another interesting thing that can be used when creating any kind of presentation or data visualization are pre-attentive attributes. And these are visual properties that our mind processes without any effort. So these are the things that basically stand out because they are different, and it comes even from prehistorical times that we have this, our brains are prepared to spot the differences, to find anomalies. So we can play with this to basically draw attention super quick to where we want our users to look at. So the pre-attentive attributes, they signal where to look, and they should be used strategically or they lose their power. If everything is different, everything stands out, it becomes quite difficult they don't really add value. But you can see, for example, in this example below, if you look to the numbers on the left, and I would ask you, can you tell me how many 8s are there? It becomes super difficult. You have to look one by one. If on the contrary, I highlight the 8s with a different color, then they stand out. Even if I don't ask you to count the 8s or to notice if we have many 8s or not, immediately when you look at the image on the right, you look at 8s and you see there's a lot of 8s or not. And so the point is, if we don't add something like this different, our audience is left to process everything. And for example, if my point was to make that we have a lot of 8s or at least 1 or 2 8s per row, and if I just gave the image on the left, well, the audience might conclude that or not, or any other thing, and look to any other numbers. But if I have a clear point, well, why not help my audience come to it rather than make them process one by one and expect that they'll come to the same conclusion that I want to. And we can use these values these attributes, pre-attentive attributes, in shapes. And so basically our eyes, our brains, they are immediately drawn to the one thing that is different within each group. So here are some examples with orientation, with the size, with the hue or color, the line width, line length, and the shape. Basically anything that is different, it stands out. But again, for example, if we have on size, if we have all the circles with a lot of different sizes, then that one that is a little bit bigger would not stand out. So we just have to be, it's super powerful when used with moderation. But if we overuse it, it loses its power. The same with text, we can do something similar. We can use bold, italic, different color, underlined, or change the size. We also use the spatial separation. From this, I think I would advise mostly to use bold color and the spatial separation. Normally italic or underlined, it actually adds more noise. So our visualization stops being so clean. But with bold and coloring, it actually stands out a lot. Also size can also be interesting. just again, be sure not to use all of them, because this part is important, that one is also, but I also want to draw attention to the first one. So should always have a very clear end in mind, and that we leverage these techniques to make our point. Finally, I would like to go through some little design tips. I think a lot of them we already talked about it, but just well, to add some more information. One is about colors. So see, very often it's very common that we want to add a lot of colors to everything. Everything is important. This is important because of that. So color is also one of these pre-attentive attributes. So basically, if we use too many colors, the use is the same as using no color. You know, we don't know to what exactly are we supposed to look at. So color should be used with a very specific purpose in mind. So we should only actually add color when we have a purpose for it. I think an interesting exercise to do is if you have a visualization, just take a step back and put everything gray, and then just color actually what you think is important to color. And so you basically just add things that add value. Something interesting to be aware of is that the different colors affect human emotions differently. So you can search for something that is a color emotion guide, and you can see how different colors draw your emotions to different states. So, and mostly a lot of companies use this. So the logos, there's some scheme behind. So also think, for example, red can also, besides having this use and bold value, it's very commonly associated with danger, with something wrong. So maybe think twice before having a title in red or something pointed in red. The other thing is it's very important to be consistent when you are using colors. So for example, we should have titles with the same color. You should have, if we want to highlight something, we should always use the same color to highlight, especially if we are doing something as a presentation with different slides, just to make so our audience basically learns that this is the color to pay attention to, this is the color that represents danger or something bad, this is the color for good. And so if we are consistent, again, we are taking this cognitive load from our audience of understanding, what does this color mean? Should I pay attention to this or that? Which one is the important? So basically just have a set of colors that you use and try to be consistent with their purpose along your presentations. Two other things. One is using white space strategically. We already talked a little bit about this, but it's again, not adding things just for the sake of adding. And white space in visualizations ends up working a little bit like making a pause when you are speaking, or having, or on your text to add a paragraph. It's just about giving space to your information, not overloading, not thinking everything is important, but sometimes less is more. So just don't be afraid of white space and use it, leverage it. The other one is to take attention to contrast. So again, contrast, like in the case of colors, if everything is different, we don't pay attention to any specific thing. But if we use it wisely, it can be super powerful and really draw the attention to where we want people to look at. A final tip is about alignment. So we should, the more aligned our visualizations are, the easier it is to our audience to process it. It basically just takes, again, this effort of trying to group things just with our head. So we should try to keep our margins aligned, have clear vertical and horizontal lines. And this just makes everything neat and much easier to process. So then we can actually focus on the information and not have this feeling of sometimes even anxiety that things are not in the correct place. Yeah, so here are just some books that some of the books that I think are quite interesting as reference, not just for anyone working specifically as a data analyst or BI consultant, but in general, because I think so many people so often have this in any job, to make a presentation or to make a point. So, and especially the first one, the storytelling with data, I think there's a lot of key points that are quite interesting. So I recommend it. very much. And thank you. Now we have some time now for some questions.
Thank you, Rita. That was very insightful and great presentation. We already have some comments in the chat of people thanking you. And actually, we have a couple of questions. Let's see. So the first one, very interesting. Are there any specific issues you've run into creating visualization for different cultures and people with different backgrounds?
Interesting. I had some mostly regarding time, the way we process months, and so in different parts of the world, people use different calendars. And on my case specifically, coming from the Occidental calendar, I would assume, or I wrongly assumed at the beginning, that this is what everyone wants to see, and they want to see data organized by our calendar. So it's very interesting, and this comes to the part of the who. So who is our presentation for? The same with alignment. So in some countries, in Arabic, for example, they have right to left alignment. And my own bias when creating a presentation is to align everything to the left, because this is how I read and process. So it's really, really interesting to pay attention to this, to our audience, and don't make these beginner mistakes of not knowing in what language are they gonna check the dashboards. Also, by default, a lot of tools, they are unfortunately much more adjusted to the English language. So by default, they make you even make this mistake. So one that I had a lot of issues was converting dates to the Persian calendar, just because there was no easy go-to function that does that. So mostly on that, I think it's very important to pay attention. What is the common? Don't assume that your common is what everyone uses. So really know your audience.
Thank you. Next one, what is the most effective way to visualize data with hundreds of dimensions in a dashboard? Wondering if there is another way than having hundreds of charts on a single page.
Yeah, I think hundreds of dimensions is quite complicated always. I think one interesting, I think the point is the analyst should be the one first analyzing all these dimensions and understanding which ones have interesting correlations, and then based on that create a presentation showing the exact ones. If it really has to be up to the audience to process all this information, the way is to basically have a visualization with filters where the audience can click in, click out of like a parameter for the different dimensions that we want to compare, and allow users to do it. The other way could be, for example, to create a matrix basically with the Scatterplot, and you can maybe have 5 times 5 combinations of correlation graphs. And so that at the beginning, even for the analyst, it helps you quickly see the relations between a lot of variables, and from there you can see which ones are the most important. But again, I would really suggest thinking at the beginning, do we really have this need to show all the dimensions and variables to our audience, or should this be some kind of background work that we should do before preparing our visualizations?
Thank you. This is a more practical question. So when talking about data analysis and BI in general, what are the main software which is used as tools nowadays? So we have Power BI, Tableau. What are some others that are popular?
Well, I think those two are actually the really most used to. I think Google Data Studio, for example, is also quite used, also because it has a free version that can be used very often. But I think in terms of power and flexibility, both Tableau as Power BI are some of the most interesting, are also some of the most widely used in a lot of different industries. And for example, Tableau, that is one of the ones that I really enjoy and work the most. It has a public version, so it really allows, and it has a huge community. I think Power BI as well. So it's quite easy to find solutions. You can find, there's very for example, in Tableau, there's a very interesting challenge called the Monday challenge, where basically weekly they promote a story, and you have to create a visualization for it, and then you can compare visualizations from other people. What did they do? You can hear feedback. So there's a very, very big community, and so it's quite an interesting world when you start on it. Or I know more about it than Power BI, but it's really a powerful tool. And of course, there are others that are used, but especially if you are entering this kind of work, I think makes more sense to explore one of the tools that is mostly widely used than a specific case. But on the other side, once you start understanding how the components work together, every tool ends up doing more or less the same. So once you have this logic, what are dimensions, what are measures, and also to have these points, you can do all these graphs even in Excel if you have. So it's not just about the tool is a tool to an end, but some of the most important work is understanding before that what actually you want to pass, what you want to convey. Then at the end, any tool will do what you tell it to, with more effort, less effort, more help from the online community or not. But I would really recommend both Tableau or Power BI, I think, as the go-to and most used ones.
Yeah, I think that community challenge is very interesting because you always learn much more when you can share it with other people and communicate and easily find solutions to the problems you encounter.
In fact, and because you have this time to first you think by yourself, how do you want to do it? And you look at the data and you think about the story you want to create. And then after a week, you see all the dashboards from different people that looked at the exact same data as you. So it's really interesting to have this time first on your own and then compare and listen to feedback and see so many different ways that, because in all these visualizations, there's no one right way to do it. So the more you are exposed to different ways, the
better you become.
You have for the future. Yeah.
That's great. Okay, we have another one for the tools and apps by Amelia, but that's already answered. So Rita recommended Power BI and Tableau. Tableau is what she uses daily. Same question. So this is the most popular question among the attendees. Okay, for Google Data Studio, I'm not sure if you've used it a lot. You mentioned it before. A question, is it an overkill when there is only a limited amount of records to take from, around 100 to 100 and not thousands?
If it's overkill, I think not. It has some, normally if you have not so many records, Excel, for example, can do most of it, but Google Data Studio allows you to have the interactivity. Excel also, but I think it's visually more appealing and easier to go to. So actually, I think you can create very interesting things, even reports. You can apply different filters for a different audience. So even, for example, in Excel, maybe you would have to create different worksheets for different users. And in Google Data Studio, you have some functionalities that allow you to filter a priori to depending on the person. So I think, and especially because it's free, mostly free tool, especially if you have low amounts of data. Once you start having a database and huge things to manage, then it might get expensive. But at the beginning, I think it's a very interesting tool. And also, if you don't have any experience in BI tools, it might be one of the simplest and interesting to start, because it doesn't have so many options, but at the same time, it starts giving you all these notions on how things relate and what you can adjust and so on.
Okay, one last question. Do you recommend using a tree map? And if yes, in which cases?
A tree map. Tree map can be interesting. Again, if you have a specific purpose on your mind, you don't want to show a tree with everything and leave the user to look at every node, at every category. So for example, if you want to illustrate some, for example, the audience that you have or the public that you have, and you want to differentiate the different segments, and you can put a little percentage. So on this node goes 30%, on that node goes 70%. And you basically can highlight all the path to a way to the end. So it's not so much about the tree itself, but really highlighting a path. Or if you have a process that you went through and you want to show how you, so for example, you arrive to your end set of data and you want to tell your audience all the exclusions, all the filters you added. So it's a quite interesting way to show which turn did you take, if you went left or right, did you choose one with the threshold above this or that. So it can be interesting, but again, I recommend that you always have a specific purpose or a path you want to highlight or a node, not just show everything and every possible thing. You should show it. You can show just to, so the public has a sense of the dimension of choices that you had or the thousands of variables that were in question, but really make sure to point to use it with a purpose.
He says thank you. Okay, we have another one. How do you decide, and it's very interesting, which visualization to use for a specific data? What is your thought process behind these decisions?
I think it's a bit what I tried to talk about at the beginning. First is to understand exactly what is the point. Why do we want to make a visualization? So for example, very often I create dashboards that are very exploratory. We just have tables and tables of data because we want to allow users to filter it and to explore it. So in that case, if you want to have all the data, well, there's no really other way than a table. And then it's really about the purpose. So do we want to pass some kind of message, call to action? If it's evolution over time, I would look at the line graphs. If I'm comparing categories, I would look at the bars. So basically, it's about always having this purpose in mind, and based on that, look to which kind of visualization serves the point best.
Great. Thank you. Any other question before we wrap up the talk? Rita, maybe there's something else you want to add as a final thought.
I just think not only for data analysts, I think it's quite important to pay attention how we pass information. And I think once you, for example, once you pay attention to the existence of the pre-attentive attributes, you can start noticing in every kind of publicity of image all around you. So really pay attention to the power that you have when you are communicating and to the little things you can do. But also you can think about it the other way. When someone is passing an information to you, if they're drawing attention more to something, maybe there's a specific purpose to it. So just try to be more aware, I think, to the potential. That is, it's not just numbers. There's a lot of, can be a lot of psychology involved. So keep it in mind. It's an interesting area to explore.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the session. I'm sure that our audience enjoyed it too, because we got a lot of nice comments in the chat from people attending. Thanks everyone for joining. The video will be live on our YouTube channel afterwards, so make sure to subscribe to get it if you didn't manage to watch the whole. And next month we have another session, so again, subscribe to make sure that you get all the latest info and join us again. Thanks, Rita, again for your time, for the wonderful presentation. And yeah, see you next month.
Okay, thank you. And thanks everyone for joining and for the questions.
Thank you, bye.